Hey everyone, welcome back to Grid Chat, your one-stop shop for everything going on in the world of Formula One. I'm your host, Marissa Tandon, and today we are recapping the Canadian Grand Prix, which means we have an insane amount of drama to talk about. As always, we'll go through things that were happening before the race, qualifying, things that were notable in free practice, and large storylines going into this race. Then we'll go through the race itself, I'll answer any questions that you guys sent in, and we will talk about our hot takes and predictions for the next race. And because we had battles on track, groundhogs to mourn, and a lot of kind of back and forth excitement on this track, let's just jump right into things this week. Heading into this race, there were a couple of notable storylines that were sort of carried over from last week in Barcelona. One of the major things that we were looking at this week and wondering about was George Russell versus Max Verstappen. Max was going into this race weekend exactly 1 point away from a mandatory race ban. And I've done a couple of videos kind of covering how we got to this, but as a refresher, if you're not aware of what penalty points are or how they work, in Formula One, the current penalty point system that we have was established in 2014. And under that penalty point system, if drivers receive 12 penalty points within a 12-month period, they receive an automatic one-race suspension. After Max's incident on track with George Russell, he has 11 penalty points. And Max's penalty points don't start expiring until the end of this month, when 2 of the points that he earned in Austria last year will expire. Because of that, he knew he was going into this race weekend with the requirement to race very clean this weekend as well as next weekend, so that he can have those 2 penalty points expire and start to kind of have that wider berth again. Once those 2 penalty points expire, he'll have a 3-point berth, which would kind of require him to do something pretty extreme in order to find himself on the wrong end of a race ban. However, when you look at what happened in Barcelona, we talked about this a lot in the Barcelona recap. Max had hard tires on during the safety car restart because he was on a 3-stop strategy and had run out of other tire compound options. And because of that, he found himself quickly overtaken by Charles Leclerc in a Ferrari at that safety car restart, and George Russell was getting ready to overtake him as well. In order to keep from being overtaken by George Russell in a sort of double overtake situation, Max went off the track, but in a space that was legal. However, because he did go off the track, his team told him to hand the position back to George Russell, anticipating that he would receive a penalty for gaining an advantage off track. Ultimately, Max would not have been penalized for that maneuver, but what he was penalized for was that while he was arguing with his team, he slowed down, making it look like he was giving George the position back, and when George did move to take that position, Max accelerated, causing contact with George, and ultimately was penalized for that and received penalty points. All of that being said, that's how we got into this situation. But one thing I think is interesting to point out going into this race weekend, especially with some of the words that were exchanged, is that one of the penalty points that Max received last season that he still has on his license was actually kind of George's doing. In the Qatar Grand Prix last year during qualifying, Max takes pole position. However, on a cooldown lap, he finds himself kind of in front of George in a way that was not necessarily dangerous and was not necessarily consequential to the way that qualifying ended. However, George made a big deal of this over the radio, and then both of them were called to the stewards to deal with the situation. Ultimately, Max was penalized, dropping him down 1 position on the starting grid and giving him a single penalty point on his license, which stays for 12 months, meaning that that was something that could affect this season, 2025. And the drama that came out of that when they were going head to head about that situation was pretty intense. That's where we had Max say that he had lost all respect for George, and where he said he had never seen someone try to screw someone over as intensely as George had Max in the steward's room. That same situation is where we had George hit back, where he said that it was kind of crazy that Max was questioning his integrity, when Max himself told George that he was going to put his effing head through a wall. The implication between the two of them continued to grow, but I do think that it's worth pointing out that that particular situation was sort of consistently instigated by George, and that situation itself did cause a penalty point that Max is now dealing with, which I think kind of heightens that drama between the two of them, just at least in terms of looking at how we got here. All of that being said, we came into this race weekend and Max had actually apologized for his move last weekend. He posted on Instagram and it was a bit of an apology, which in press this week, George said he was surprised to see because it's just not like Max. So for a moment, it seemed like it might be kind of quiet between these two and that the beef may have been squashed, especially given that Max needed to race clean in order to not have any sort of problems in regards to his penalty points. And I think that background is relevant to keep in mind when we start talking about qualifying in a little bit. Otherwise, a couple of relevant pieces of information that came up between last race and this one include Arvid Lindblad receiving a special dispensation from the FIA to have a super license before he turns 18. Arvid Lindblad currently drives in F2 for Red Bull, and the special dispensation was requested by Red Bull in order to have him have this license early. While there's been no implications that Arvid would be coming into Formula One this season, there is the implication that he could potentially drive in free practice sessions, or also potentially if we need a reserve driver for Red Bull, this is another time where we could see Arvid actually brought into the fold, and why he would need that super license. Super licenses, if you're not familiar, are granted by the FIA, and in order to participate in Formula One as a driver, you have to have one. In order to get a super license, you have to have earned 40 points within the last 3 years prior to applying for the Formula One super license, and you earn those points by participating participating in other series like F2, F3, F4, even F1 Academy, the World Endurance Championship, Formula E, and a number of others. IndyCar also is a points earning series. Arvid actually already has 45 points regardless of where he finishes F2. And so him receiving that super license early is really just 2 months before his 18th birthday. He's very much shown that he has the ability to participate, and he's already done all of the other requirements for this super license. And while I don't think we're going to see Red Bull suddenly throw someone out of the Formula One seat in order to put this rookie in, I think it's most likely that Red Bull is trying to figure out what their future looks like. Because currently, Red Bull actually doesn't have a reserve driver. And so that's why it was such a question of whether or not it would be Liam Lawson or Isack Hadjar who would fill Max's seat if he actually did have a race ban. Because technically, it would be one of the two of them, since currently Red Bull doesn't have their own reserve driver. Arvid kind of gives them another option to have an additional person in the mix, because obviously if Liam or Isack had to fill in a Red Bull seat for any reason, not just a race ban, but any other reason that they would need to replace one of the other drivers, obviously it would also mean you need someone in that Racing Bull seat. So there are a lot of reasons why this might have happened, but in general, one of the big points here is that Arvid is someone to watch while you're watching the rest of this season of Formula One, paying attention to his F2 career, watching him race, and seeing how you think he might fit into the Red Bull Formula One lineup. Because as we know, Red Bull has kind of burned through a number of drivers in the last couple of years. And so we're going to start to see their talent pool become a little bit younger and newer as they try to find new people that fit into that situation, as they try to decide what they want to do with Yuki Tsunoda, as we try to see what Liam Lawson and Isack Hadjar bring to the table, and of course, as there's always a possibility that eventually Max Verstappen will no longer be driving for Red Bull, whether that's that he retires or he goes to another team. So all that being said, Arvid Lindblad, a driver to watch. And then heading into our free practice sessions, it was an interesting weekend with free practice because we had two different drivers crash. First with Charles Leclerc in the Ferrari in free practice 1, which despite actually crashing out, not being able to complete that session or even FP2, in FP1, Charles Leclerc did maintain a top 10 fastest time despite not finishing the session. And then in free practice 2, we see hometown hero Lance Stroll also crash. I think we saw a lot of lockups, a very dusty track, and we saw a very different weekend than we saw last year, given that last year we were dealing with kind of wet conditions. And so this year with free practice, we were seeing a surprising amount of performance from the Ferrari, from both of those drivers as well. And we also saw Lewis kind of talk about the idea that they had figured out something was wrong on the car and that they had fixed it. And so we were seeing this surprising performance from both of the Ferraris, which was also notable because we also had to see both of the drivers come out in support of their team principal, Fred Vasseur. There have been a number of rumors that his position is at risk at Ferrari, and it was interesting to see both of the drivers kind of speak down against those rumors and say that Fred is doing a great job, especially given that both of them have had performance that is quite low compared to their previous seasons. Ferrari currently sits third in the constructors standings, and that's after 2 seasons where we saw them kind of fighting for P2. So there's this question of what's going on at Ferrari, and are we going to see their performance actually improve? And then we see this weekend in free practice sessions, it feels like maybe we are, and then we just don't see that kind of convert all the way through qualifying. So getting into qualifying itself, we have a couple of pretty big moments. First off, we have an entire half of Alex Albon's engine cover just completely explode off the car. If you were watching, I'm sure it was quite shocking because it was shocking for me, and it was kind of an omen of what was to come for Alex's race weekend, as well as Williams almost as a whole. This was also a bit of a bummer given that last race in Barcelona, Alex also had trouble, as did Carlos. And it's always tough to see a really strong performance from a team that you don't expect one, and a really strong opening from that team, and then a sudden kind of dip in performance. We do know that Williams has already shifted away from developing their current car in favor of developing next year's car, but hopefully that doesn't mean we continue to see performance just shockingly drop in the way that it has in the last 2 race weekends. Another sad moment for Williams, we see Carlos Sainz exit in Q1 again 2 weekends in a row, though that Q1 exit this time was because he was impeded by Isack Hadjar, and Isack was penalized with a 3-place grid drop because of that. For a moment in qualifying, we were seeing really competitive cars across the board. At one point, we saw 5 different teams in the top 5 spots, which was very, very cool. We were seeing the Aston Martins put up really good times, Ferraris putting up really good times, and of course the Mercedes and the McLarens. In particular, we were seeing this really strong performance from the Aston Martins, and at one point we saw Lance Stroll actually positioned 7th, but ultimately in that session he just suddenly drops down all the way down to 18th and gets knocked out in Q1. It's always a little bit of a bummer when you see a driver who's at their home race not have a great race weekend, which this is actually a back-to-back situation where we saw Carlos Sainz have a pretty terrible race in Barcelona, and now we've seen Lance Stroll have a pretty terrible race weekend in Canada itself. Lance was also coming back from an injury where we saw him withdraw withdraw from Barcelona due to wrist pain that was kind of a reactivation of the pain he was having, where he had to have surgery after he broke both wrists. This was interesting, I did think, because I was worried we were going to see him kind of return too early, given that that seems to be what caused the problem in the first place. Lance had double wrist surgery and then got back in the car quite quickly after that accident. And now we're seeing that that injury has continued on to a point that he was not able to race in Barcelona and had to receive medical treatment. And then we saw him so quickly right back in the car. And then obviously it wasn't even for a particularly wonderful performance, despite the fact that the Aston Martin seemed to be improving this weekend. And objectively, with Fernando Alonso receiving his first points in Barcelona, improving last race weekend as well. So I do hope that Lance hasn't re-aggravated any injury. And it's always a little bit of a bummer to see a home race not go well for a driver. Our Q1 exits were Carlos Sainz, Gabriel Bortoleto, Lance Stroll, Liam Lawson, and Pierre Gasly. And the Pierre Gasly situation was actually quite interesting because for the first time since Franco Colapinto has replaced Jack Doohan, we saw a quite strong performance from Franco in qualifying. Pierre Gasly, his teammate who's been pretty solid, qualifies dead last, and Franco finally moves out of Q1. Hilariously enough, we also saw him sleeping in his car in between qualifying sessions, but I think this was a necessary situation for Franco. As we know, Franco was only guaranteed 5 races in the announcement that he would be taking over that seat, and he is coming up to the end of that. And so I think this weekend was pretty crucial for him to at least have a little bit of performance in this way, because Franco was coming back into Formula One with pretty high expectations because of how well he performed when he replaced Logan Sargent last year, and those expectations just weren't being met. This was the first time Franco has made it out of Q1 and was attempting to score his first points with Alpine, and so I think that's a very notable moment in qualifying itself. And then of course there was the fact that the medium tire was definitely the tire for qualifying, similar to how we saw in Imola. We were seeing drivers put better times down on those medium tires. Well, and ultimately, despite good performance in Q1 and Q2 from the Ferraris, we don't see them really come alive in Q3. Instead, we see Lewis Hamilton qualify 5th and Charles Leclerc qualify 8th, and then we have kind of a surprising top 4. George Russell manages to take pole position at the very end away from Max Verstappen, which is something that happened last year as well, because at this track last year, George Russell was actually on pole because he and Max Verstappen set the exact same time, but George set it first. Last year, Max won the Canadian Grand Prix, and obviously we saw that switch up this year. So we see George Russell set in first position, Max in second, Oscar Piastri in third, and Kimi Antonelli in fourth. And then of course, another kind of shocking moment was seeing Lando Norris so far away from his teammate. Both of the McLarens were actually not performing at the highest level that we feel like we have been seeing from them. This was not a dominant race weekend for them. But while Oscar still manages to be on the second row in third, Lando ends up qualifying in 7th, and everyone was a little surprised by that gap. But as I said, one of the things to take into qualifying and remember was George Russell and Max Verstappen's kind of beef that was simmering again. Because in the post-qualifying interviews, George is asked how things are going to go with them starting right next to each other. And George brings up the fact that he has a little bit more penalty points to play with on his license. Ultimately, we don't see that turn into much of anything, but it was a sort of surprising comment, I thought. Given that Max had sort of let things go, it does sort of seem like that beef is kind of continuing, and George is sort of in this moment trying to assert his sort of dominance given that he had just gotten pole. So that takes us through qualifying. Let's get into the race itself. There were a couple of different highlights to this race, and I think a lot of them had to do with kind of tire strategy and where everyone landed on that. But just to get started on that first lap, we see George get away pretty cleanly. Max isn't able to make a move very quickly, and he slots in behind him. And Kimi Antonelli makes a very strong start and overtakes Oscar Piastri for third. And that was a real defining moment of this race, because we ultimately see that top 3 order maintained for the rest of the race. George Russell ends up winning the race, Max Verstappen comes in second, and Kimi Antonelli manages to maintain his third position, getting his first podium in the entirety of his career. This also made him the 3rd youngest driver to do so, and he moves ahead of Lando Norris as the 3rd youngest driver to manage a Formula One podium finish. Also in the first lap, we see a lot of movement across the board, Nico Hülkenberg jumping up a couple of places, and all in all, a pretty chaotic start to this race, but really just in movement, not in contact or bad moves. And there were a couple of things that were pretty interesting aside from the major points that we'll go through first. First of all, there was the 2-stop versus the 1-stop strategy. And at the beginning, it seemed like we were going to see a couple of drivers actually go for a 1-stop that ended up kind of shifting that strategy and going for a 2-stop. But the 2-stop strategy seemed to be a little differing across the board, and those that started with a hard tire seemed to have a stronger advantage than those who started with a medium. We saw that the medium compound was just absolutely obliterated quite quickly in this track, and those that started on the hard tire were able to continue their first stint for much longer, which is why we saw Lando Norris kind of running the front of the race for a bit. And similarly, we saw Leclerc kind of moving towards a 1-stop strategy for a moment until he ultimately kind of against his own wishes did pit for a 2-stop strategy. One thing that feels heavily relevant to talk about this week is the Ferrari situation when it comes to strategy, because ultimately ultimately, we are continuing to see the drivers themselves argue and call their own strategy against what their engineers are calling. And it is an uncomfortable situation where we're seeing that the drivers tend to be right about what they want and that the engineering side of things is not sort of finding a way to work with them. Obviously, we're only hearing supercuts of what is most interesting and perhaps most dramatic in these races on these race radios when it comes to the broadcast, but it's also a little jarring when we're seeing drivers like Charles Leclerc say, like, I disagree with what you're saying and this is the strategy we should do, and then being called in, then kind of arguing over the radio that that was the wrong call, and ultimately not really seeing that strong race performance that he would have liked to have had. For Lewis, unfortunately, when we heard him going back and forth with his engineer, it turns out that he had damage to the car, and that damage was in fact caused by hitting a groundhog on this track. We did see him a little emotional about this afterwards, and almost one of those situations where I would have rather been told, like, oh, you hit a rock. Like, there's something so devastating about finding out that you killed a groundhog on accident doing your job, because there's no way that that groundhog who happened to wander on track made it out alive. So obviously a bummer, but also makes it a little difficult to really know what the performance of that Ferrari was based on the changes that they did make, given that Lewis seemed to sustain that damage pretty early on. However, that doesn't really account for the qualifying debacle and why they're still not able to get up into those kind of front row or second row positions. That aside, when we look at Charles Leclerc's race, I do think we're just continuing to see the Ferrari situation not move forward in the way that it needs to if they want to continue progressing in the fight for a driver's championship or a constructor's championship. They seem to have their drivers give them information, and then that information is confirmed but overlooked, and then the decisions that are made don't seem to be the ones that those drivers want, and ultimately it's not giving better performance. So hopefully it's a situation where we see that start to change, but overall it has been a little tough to watch. And another team that was having a little bit of a driver versus engineer battle was Alex Albon in the Williams. Ultimately, we see him DNF, and that was due to an engine issue that we were kind of seeing similar to the issue that he had in Barcelona. That was also noted earlier on in the race that that's what they were tracking. However, what it seemed like is that Alex Albon asked for his pit stop to happen when everybody else that was on that two-stop strategy started to pit, and they decided to stay out for a longer stint, which then put him at a bit of a disadvantage when he was driving on worse tires compared to his competitors. We were seeing him slow down significantly, we were seeing him get very easily overtaken, and we also saw him go through a bit of a battle where he was saying, I don't know why you guys don't listen to me. And then when they did call him in for a pit stop, he didn't want to take it at that point, saying that at this point they had already done so much that then kind of negated going to take that pit stop. I think there's a lot of different possibilities here. There's obviously always going to be more data on the engineer side than there is on the driver's side, especially being able to calculate that while not driving 200 miles an hour. But it does seem to be a little stretch that Alex is dealing with right now, where he came out and was performing so strongly at the beginning of this season against all expectation, both for Williams and for himself, with Carlos and all of the conversation about what it would look like for the two of them to be teammates. And so I think you have this situation where Alex really feels this pressure to perform, was performing even better than he thought he could before and starting to kind of taste that victory. And then you have obviously a downswing that Williams is experiencing right now that is also kind of pushing him further into the frustrations of wanting to do better than he is. And so I think that is something that Williams is going to need to work on managing, because we do see that James Vowles actively comes out and defends Alex in these situations and says that they could be doing more to support him. And I think that's fair, and I think that's actually good management from James. And I think James does a really good job of managing the entire team and managing the PR strategy behind them. But I would like to see maybe a little bit more harmony from Williams on the Alex side of the garage. And it seems like we've had kind of a back and forth where previously Carlos has felt a little disharmonied in this situation. And so it's hard to say where things kind of shake out, but ultimately it ends up almost being an irrelevant situation as Alex does DNF the race. Additionally, we did hear over the radio that that DNF was due to a power unit issue that was similar to the situation that he had in Barcelona, but not as severe. So there is a possibility of this being the reason that we're seeing a downturn in performance from Williams overall, that there is a power unit issue. And as we know, they are not focused on kind of redeveloping this car. They're still focused on the next year's car. So there's a possibility that there's something mechanical there that we're going to continue to see, but hopefully we see it fixed. I do still feel pretty strongly that we will see Williams finish 5th in this Constructors' Championship, which would be a huge improvement from last year and a pretty strong statement for next year. And I do hope that that's the case, which would require them to kind of work out some of these issues that they've been experiencing the last couple of weeks. In terms of other DNFs, we also saw Liam Lawson DNF with a power unit issue, which sort of continues this bad luck stretch for Liam, where we haven't really been able to see if he does have more potential than he's shown, and it's a tough weekend again for him. And we also see Franco Colapinto finish in 13th with some pretty strong on-track battles, and ultimately he would have loved to have actually had a final points finish, but I do think we saw a stronger performance from him than we expected to, and a much better performance than we have been seeing. On the other disappointing side, we do also also have Isack Hadjar not finish in the points. And of course, hometown hero Lance Stroll ends in 17th. But let's get into those big talking point moments of this race. And of course, most of that happened towards the front of the pack. Obviously, some of the biggest conversation about this race is about who won. Unlike last year, George Russell ends up being able to convert his pole position to a race win. And ultimately, we see Max get quite close, but we also don't see him make any risky moves that would actually potentially give him that race ban. And so Max does not end up passing George Russell and doesn't even really have a really strong challenge moment for a win. And by the end section of this race, even though Max does maintain that gap very close throughout the race, we don't really even see much action from those first two positions. And Kimi Antonelli is kind of comfortably behind in third, not really challenging for that second place position either. And frankly, except for when tires were starting to degrade and everybody was starting to bunch up again, or after pit stop strategies when we were seeing people trying to make sure they weren't getting undercut, there wasn't a lot of excitement to this race outside of the first few laps and the last few laps. And those last few laps are obviously where most of the conversation about this race has sat, because Oscar Piastri got overtaken by Kimi Antonelli right in that first lap, and Kimi Antonelli managed to maintain that third position, and Oscar was being held at fourth. Lando Norris, on the other hand, had fought his way up from 7th all the way up to 5th, and was chasing his teammate down in these last few laps. Because of that chase, we also saw that Kimi Antonelli was really close to getting overtaken, but I think the battle between these two teammates kept Oscar from being able to focus on overtaking Kimi Antonelli for that final podium position, and instead had to focus on fighting back his teammate. Regardless, we did see both Oscar and Lando so close to Kimi that it was getting to a point where after the race, Kimi literally said he wasn't sure who to give the slipstream to because they were both within DRS. And we also saw, interestingly enough, Lando Norris's engineer actually really encouraging him to get into the fight, to try to make a move on Oscar before he had DRS. I think what this really pointed out was that we were out of this space that we've been in with McLaren before, where we've seen almost a very careful version of what these two drivers are allowed to do on track, despite this kind of repeated idea of papaya rules where they're free to race but not crash each other. This really felt like not only were they free to race, but Lando was being encouraged to really show what he had. At this point, he had a really great race, being able to move up from 7th all the way up to 5th and be able to close that gap onto your teammate while the car had not been performing as well as they had been previously. And after an objectively poor qualifying, Lando is actually receiving kind of this support, this encouragement from his engineer, telling him to overtake and to make the move. And we see Lando get close a couple of times, but not actually be able to fully execute an overtake. With that being said, part of that has to do with the fact that Oscar was so close to Kimi, and Oscar was kind of dealing with a threat from behind as well as a potential overtake in front, and the fact that getting a little bit more space between himself and Lando would continue to open up his gap to the championship. But all of that being said, Lando takes a risk, and that risk does not turn out well. Lando ends up colliding with the back of Oscar's car and the wall, loses his front wing, and has to retire from the race. Ultimately, this means that the race then finishes under safety car, locking in the order at that point, meaning that Max is not able to continue trying to attack George for the race win, and Kimi Antonelli secures that first podium because Oscar does not have the ability to continue attacking him for third. And of course, Lando ends up with a DNF and no points for this race. It ultimately means that Lando ends up losing 12 points to Oscar in this championship battle rather than just the 2 that he would have lost had he finished the race. And it means that Max is able to close in a little tighter to this championship battle. And so all that being said, what does that really mean for Lando? Well, ultimately, I think it actually means that he's moving towards taking risks that he wasn't moving towards before. Lando has been, of the two drivers, a bit more timid and a little bit more risk averse. And seeing him actually make this move on his teammate, a move that ultimately didn't pan out, feels like he's actually moving forward in making those risks. And you have to take those risks in order to actually win a championship. This is actually the same type of battle and result that we saw from Jenson Button and Lewis Hamilton when they were fighting for a championship between the two of them as teammates in 2011 at this very track. We saw them also crash. And ultimately, they were two very intense championship contenders that obviously went on to have pretty good careers. I think what we've been missing from this championship battle between Lando and Oscar is a willingness to take a risk that could potentially end badly for both or either of them. And I think we're now in a place where Lando and Oscar both are willing to do that, which means that I think this championship battle is about to heat up in a very different way. Strategically, why would they be willing to do this? Frankly, part of that has to be because of how far ahead McLaren is in the Constructors' Championship. McLaren currently sits in first for the Constructors' Championship at 374 points, and their closest competitor is Mercedes in P2 with 199, meaning that they have a 175-point berth between them and next place. So at this point, yeah, you can afford to take a couple of risks, even if that means one of your drivers goes home without points that race. As long as they're not crashing every race, and as long as they're still having strong performances, they're up against teams that are not putting points on the board in the same way. While Kimi Antonelli and George Russell could become a bigger threat throughout the rest of the season, they still have this huge gap to make up, and it would require both of these drivers to really be impressive all the time and McLaren to be crashing out every weekend. I feel pretty strongly that we're going to see McLaren go back to back for constructors titles here, and that means that there is a little bit more focus early on in a different way this year to allow them to kind of play through this drivers' championship battle and see who really comes out on top. The question will be how both of them respond to this type of issue, because Lando came out of that crash and immediately took responsibility, explained his reasoning, apologized to the team and apologized to Oscar, and hopefully seemed to kind of move on. Oscar also did not seem to have much bad blood about the situation, especially given that it didn't ultimately affect his race, but I think you have both of them on alert now. Both of these drivers are willing to take risks, and both of these drivers want more than anything to win this title. This also means that Max ends up being a bit closer in this conversation for a driver's title again, which again is a complete 180 from where we were last week, where Max was asked about his driver's title fight and basically kind of seemed like he was over it. Max only took home 1 point in Barcelona, but then comes in second here and is ahead of both of those McLaren drivers. And so our driver title battle has kind of shifted. Oscar is at 198 points in first position still, and Lando is at 176 in second, but Max is right behind him at 155. And so now the spread across these three drivers is actually pretty surmountable. One race could change everything. Race to race, everything could change in the driver's fight. And that is a pretty exciting place to be. Because to me, getting back into an era of racing where teammates are so closely locked in that we actually are seeing the top team be incredibly competitive between both drivers is something that we haven't had in quite a while. I think the last time we really had that was Nico Rosberg and Lewis Hamilton before Nico retired. Because after that, we saw Lewis Hamilton's teammate become Valtteri Bottas, and Valtteri really served as a strong second driver that was willing to take a back seat to Lewis's championship titles. And so instead, we saw those battles be between drivers that were not teammates. And in a similar regard, we've seen Max Verstappen also kind of dominate his own team with teammates that are nowhere near him. And so the last 4 titles that Max has not been him having really any contention from his teammate in what was arguably previously the best car on the grid. Instead of having 2 drivers that were so incredible in the best car on the grid like we've had previously, the last kind of 2 eras of very dominant drivers and championships have been a really dominant car with 1 really dominant driver. And the McLaren teammate battle is really the first time that we've seen 2 of these drivers go head to head in the best car in a long time. So if we're at a point where both of these drivers are really willing to take risks, it means that while we may continue to see McLaren be extremely dominant in the Constructors' Championship, the driver's title becomes a lot tighter and a lot more exciting to watch. And it's something that gets to stretch all the way from this round all the way through the rest of the season, hopefully, where we can see the situation where they are taking points off of each other and they're keeping the battle between the drivers open. And to me, that's more exciting. I think it's more exciting to get to see drivers actually go head to head all the way from one line to the other, bell to bell for the whole season. And I think as much as it sucks that we saw Lando DNF, it's still exciting to see him willing to take that risk. Even if that risk seemed like bad judgment, even if that risk seemed like that gap that he was talking about was never going to be there, it's still exciting to see him willing to put it all out there and to attempt to win a race. Even if that means not finishing it, even if that means crashing both of them out, these strong moves are the types of moves that we haven't been seeing from Lando that now we'll get to see from both drivers, hopefully moving forward. Again, all of that speculation, it depends on how everybody returns to the track next week, but it really seems like there was no bad blood in the team itself, that Lando took responsibility for the move that he made and for what it cost the team, and that moving forward, we'll see a way for both of these drivers to continue fighting it out on track. And that's really all I think I've been saying I want to see. I really want to see them actually be able to race when there's not a need for team orders, when they're so far ahead in the Constructors' Championship. I want to see them go head to head, and I want to see what both of these drivers really have to offer. And I think in the end, we might end up seeing them both 1-2 in this driver's title, and potentially that ends up opening a new era for something like a Nico Rosberg, Lewis Hamilton back and forth, for something like a Jenson Button, Lewis Hamilton battle. I really would like to see what it looks like when 2 really good drivers are in a really good car and are willing to fight it out, even if that means not finishing a race. So for me, that's kind of the biggest takeaway from this race. And the second biggest takeaway is Kimi Antonelli getting on that podium, because I was shouting for him as soon as we got to the point where it sounded like he was going to make it. And as he was actively being hunted by both of these McLaren drivers for that final spot on the podium, I was just desperate for them to leave him alone and let him just have it. Kimi Antonelli becomes the 3rd youngest driver to take a podium in Formula One. And with that, it's hopefully the beginning of a lot more success for him. And for our title standings after this race, Oscar, Lando, and Max are quite close. Oscar has a 22-point lead on Lando. Lando has a 21-point lead on Max. Max has a 19-point lead on George. And then for a larger gap, George has a 32-point lead on Charles Leclerc. I will say it is exciting to see other people getting back into the fight. While I don't think Constructors' Championship titles are going to change hands from McLaren, as it would take a pretty big change in performance across the board, I do think it's exciting to see this many drivers legitimately in contention for the title, and a possibility of really good on-track fighting moving forward. So that wraps up most of what happened on track in Canada. The last thing we do have to talk about is that after the race, Red Bull lodged a protest against George Russell's win, and that was because of what they called unsportsmanlike behavior. And ultimately, the argument went back and forth. But what it seemed like Red Bull's argument was that George was trying to get Max in trouble under the safety car to get that last penalty point that would end in a race ban. George reported quickly over the radio that Max overtook him under a safety car, which is illegal and would have resulted in that last point. On the flip side, Max said that George had braked suddenly under that safety car, forcing him to overtake on accident. Ultimately, the ruling was that nobody did anything wrong and that no penalties were awarded and that everything stayed the same, meaning George kept his win. But it is an interesting conversation that's hard to say there wasn't anything there when George was kind of poking the bear throughout this situation and talking about the fact that he had more penalty points to play with under his license. The main thing is that George did brake, which then caused Max to overtake on accident and then kind of move backwards. Under a safety car, the lead car does have to keep a certain amount of space between them and the safety car, and you can't suddenly brake under that safety car. And also, of course, you can't overtake under that safety car either. A lot of speculation has been had about whether or not George was intentionally trying to get Max to get one more penalty point so that he would get banned, and whether that was sort of a final attempt in this race to do so. I do have to say that the stewards ruled that that is not what happened, and also to say that Red Bull actually did not say that that's what happened. Red Bull was saying that George's actual report over the radio was the unsportsmanlike part, but the FIA in their ruling reported actually on both sides so that there was clarity overall. Whether you feel one way or another may be more biased based on your opinion on who you'd like to see kind of win this beef, but I think ultimately we have to go with what the FIA said, which is that nobody did anything wrong. So that wraps up our Canada weekend. Next race will be in Austria, and that is also going to be the last weekend that Max really has to worry heavily about his penalty points. 2 of them will fall off directly after that race weekend. A couple of things to look out for into this next race weekend include Franco Colapinto's future at Alpine, whether or not he'll get to continue after his 5 races. If he doesn't, who would come back? Would they put Jack Doohan back in that seat? Would they extend Franco race by race? Would they put someone else in the seat? And what does the future of Alpine look like overall? Can Williams get things back together and bring back that strong performance that we saw at the beginning of the season? Will Kimi Antonelli convert to another podium and hopefully a race win? Or is the speed from Mercedes that we saw this weekend not necessarily their constant performance? Because both drivers were kind of unwilling to commit to whether or not that was the case. In terms of predictions for next race, I think we're going to see renewed fighting energy from both Lando and Oscar, and we're going to see a strong title battle from here on in. I don't think we're going to see aggressive driving in a risk-based standpoint from Max, at least in Austria, given the penalty point situation, but I do think we're going to see a new hunger awoken in him once he realizes that he has kind of gotten back into this championship title fight. And I think it'll be interesting to see what kind of performance the Ferraris bring back. Do we ever see them adjust this relationship between engineer and strategy and the drivers, or do we just continue to feel pain regardless of how the car performs? This has been your Canadian Grand Prix recap. Hopefully I answered any of the questions that you sent in. Those kind of got mixed into the episode this week because I had already covered them. And of course, if you ever want to be able to share your questions, you can always send them in via my social media, which is at Marissa Kumari on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and TikTok, and of course Threads. You can follow me on all of those platforms in order to send your questions in every week and to get kind of in-depth things like this week we did Behind the Beef, covering George Russell and Max Verstappen's beef in order to make sure we knew where we were going heading into this race weekend. So you can always follow me on all of those platforms. You can leave your questions in the comment sections of this episode on YouTube. Make sure you are subscribed wherever you're listening. And of course, you can also always join our grid chat server. If you join the Discord server, you can always ask your questions there, be alerted of new episodes or new videos, and of course, you'll get to watch the races with everybody in the Discord chat. We typically watch the races over chat every week, and it's a really nice way to watch the races, especially for early time zone ones, or if you're typically watching races alone. So I hope you have enjoyed the Canadian Grand Prix, and I look forward to seeing you for the Austrian recap.